Hello, this is part of a series of very short videos looking at heart rate monitoring. I now want to look at some of the cons or the challenges of heart rate monitoring. So it can be very helpful in terms of helping people understand what could be causing post-exertion malaise. It can be helpful in working out how to carry out activities in a way that is less exerting, and it can be helpful in recording activity diaries, and it's got a lot of things that can be helpful with, but what are the negatives? One negative I would say is that the formulas that we've seen and the whole research in heart rate monitoring has not been focused around young people. So for young people, there is an issue that the numbers from the formulas might not work perfectly for them. So for instance, with POTS, we often look at for younger people, so in their early 20s, in their late teens, and children, we normally wouldn't look to diagnose POTS on a 30 beats per minute increase in heart rate understanding. We might look to more 40 because their heart rate can go up and down more quickly on activity. So there may be issues where the formula is slightly wrong or works less well. Just as the older formulas were looking at sort of 220 minus age and then multiplying that by a number, now taking the sort of lower number, the 208 seemed to work more accurately for the population as a whole rather than just males. So there may be an issue where the formula is out by a couple of beats per minute, and that's something to be aware of. So the solution for that is really, I would say, have a few more days where you're checking the data first without setting an alarm, and then work out, as anyone should, what the right rate is going to be for them, and review it every couple of weeks. So it might be, rather than 15 or 20 beats per minute above resting heart rate, you go 1 or 2 beats per minute higher and take things from there. So age is an obvious one. It's we've not had enough research done with younger people, but the theory and the likelihood is it will still work fine. Some people can have issues with their heart, or they can have conditions such as POTS, and they can create issues. So if someone's got something like SVT, they can find they're just resting, they're not doing anything, and their heart rate just spikes really high. If that happens and you're using an alarm, the alarm will go off. You're just resting, that isn't necessarily helpful. Now, for some people, it will mean setting an alarm isn't a good idea for them, because it might be upsetting, it might be distressing, it might just be annoying. So the alarm setting, it might change whether or not that's worth doing. Even if it is worth setting the alarm, it can make looking at the data harder. So if you're looking back to see what you're doing and there's suddenly a spike, um, if you can't remember, it's hard to know, was I overexerting myself or was this just a spike because of SVT or something like that? And it can be difficult. It can create somewhat I call like noise, making it harder to actually work out what's going on in terms of exertion. Now, with POTS and dysautonomia in general, what you sort of find is that there's not just one standard impact that's true across the board. So it can be different person to person. So for some people, they might stand and they might get a very, very big short-term fluctuation on standing, and then that stabilizes. Now, if that's the case, they might not meet the criteria for POTS diagnosis. They could still be experiencing symptoms, but every time they stand, this might happen. So then having an alarm that goes off every time they stand, that might be distracting for them. It might not be helpful. It might be that they need some medication to help sort this problem out. And then the heart rate monitoring can sort of work normally. It might be, as I'm sort of saying, it's something else that creates noise, which means they need to adapt how they use the heart rate monitoring. And it might just be harder to see sort of what's going on exertion-wise. I would caution, though, just if your heart rate goes up and standing, this could be because standing and getting up when you're very ill is actually incredibly exerting, and it is likely to be over exerting. So just because your heart rate goes up by a lot doesn't mean heart rate monitoring doesn't work for you. Now, this does bring on sort of two other categories that kind of branch out in slightly different directions. One is looking at the very ill, or people who are in a sort of crash sort of state. Now, when people are in that crash state, very, very little is needed to trigger sort of alarm going off. And I would argue that focusing on the peaks, as heart rate monitoring can sometimes encourage people to do, isn't necessarily the best thing to be doing. If you're experiencing a crash, I would normally encourage people to focus on getting high quality rest, do the bare minimum that they need to do activity wise, focus on improving the rest, focus on regular short periods of rest, and sort of take things from there. And whilst heart rate monitoring can help with that, it's very easy to, if you have an alarm, focus on the alarm going off and focus on the spikes rather than focusing on having more time where you're kind of getting near your resting heart rate, getting good quality rest. So some people in those situations, it'd be best turning off an alarm. They may be best not looking too closely at heart rate monitoring at all. It might be really helpful in auditing the quality of the rest. They might think they're just lying on the sofa all day doing nothing, and actually they might be thinking about things that are exhausting. There might be a lot of emotions they're experiencing that are taking a lot of their energy, and stopping good quality rest happen. It could be helpful, but it's less certain. So the other sort of, walking back the path, the other sort of area that can be sort of an issue is medication that affects your heart rate, blood pressure. Now, some people are on medication and that affects the heart rate. And that can also, when we're looking at the formulas, the numbers to come up with, it can mean it's a different number. It can also sometimes mean you can't reliably use heart rate monitoring data in the same way because you're taking medication that suppress those spikes and drops that would otherwise warn you of overexertion. So be mindful that some medication could cause a problem. Some medication can raise or lower your heart rate. Often, if you use the formulas based around resting heart rate, they are more adaptive. So if you're on medication that lowers your heart rate by 20 beats per minute, it will also lower your resting heart rate, and you can just go off the new resting heart rate when you're doing calculations, and that's likely to be right. But a word of caution, just need to be mindful that it's not always 100% so, and you may need to adjust the numbers or the validity and effectiveness of heart rate monitoring for you on the basis of certain medications you're on. So those are the main sort of categories of people I would sort of say that there can be issues to be aware of. There's one sort of last category, and it's very much sort of more like sort of a personality trait. It might be that you find heart rate monitoring exhausting. It might be you see every spike, you get really upset. It might be really distressing for you. It might be that it just annoys you every time the alarm goes off. And I've spoken with people and I've worked with people around heart rate monitoring, and that's been very true. That what has happened for them is the process has been ultimately unhelpful because they got so annoyed by the heart rate monitor that actually it caused more exertion with their annoyance than if they hadn't used it. And they weren't really able to get anything out of using the heart rate monitor. So there are some people for whom heart rate monitoring, for a range of reasons, isn't going to be right. The one other category I would say is there might be people who, without support, could misunderstand the process. And I wouldn't say it's a very complicated process, but it's quite easy if you're fatigued, if you've got brain fog, to not really understand or absorb information correctly. And I think there are some approaches recommended with heart rate monitoring that I don't 100% agree with. I think they are overly rigid and they don't necessarily work for everybody. And equally, the other way around is there's people who are almost not rigid enough and they're just sort of not really accepting the information that's coming in from heart rate monitoring, so they're not actually getting the benefits from them. It might be they can use it to back up what they're doing when it's what they want to do, and when it's not what they want to do, they don't pay too much attention. So there are sort of issues on, are you the right personality? Do you have the right support to benefit from heart rate monitoring? And I mean, the other sort of, when we're looking at cons of heart rate monitoring, the biggest con is that there's not, at the time we're doing this video, a good, reliable, affordable heart rate monitor that I would wholeheartedly and 100% recommend for people for basic. All the devices have been designed with a focus more on sports or on people who like fancy gadgets. They're not really focused on ill people who need something that's easy and simple to use. So none of the devices have been really set up with software to create heart rate alarms in the way that we would kind of want. So quite often what you're having to do is either use adapted software. Visible is working in this to try to make software much more accessible for ill people to use to enable them to get the benefits of heart rate monitoring. Or you're going to have to hack into something that's really designed for a different purpose. And that's what sort of I've done with the Garmin device that I use. Now, hacking into something seems very complicated. It's not that complicated, but it's enough of a barrier that without support, some people are going to get excluded from heart rate monitoring as a result. So that's me had a look at some of the negatives of heart rate monitoring and things people need to be aware of. I'll do some more videos looking at how you can actually use heart rate monitoring to help you. Okay, thanks.